Hello, I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo magazine, and I'm delighted that you've chosen to watch this TAFAF talk. In the recording that follows, you're going to hear three eminent speakers discussing the role of contemporary and post-war art in sacred spaces, and it's time to coincide with the recent reopening of the Rothko Chapel in Houston. I hope you enjoy watching this TAFAF talk. Hello and welcome to TAFAF Talks. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo magazine, and I'm delighted that for this TAFAF Online, the first online fair that TAFAF has produced, that Apollo has joined forces with TAFAF to create a series of events, talks, which have topical focuses, and we've got a great lineup for over the next 3 evenings. This evening, we're going to be talking about sacred spaces and post-war art. And I'll introduce the panel in a minute, but let me give you a sense of what's drawn us to this today. You can probably see on your screen an image of the Rothko Chapel in Houston since its recent restoration and renovation, with the skylight opened up. And this opened again this autumn, just in advance of the 50th anniversary of the chapel next year. The idea of the sacred space is sometimes considered a footnote in the history of art in the modern period, perhaps a hangover from the Renaissance or the Baroque times. But in fact, as we're going to be exploring tonight, it's a very rich tradition. We're thinking about artists such as Louise Nevelson, who worked on the commission of Father Ralph Peterson on the chapel of the Good Shepherd at St. Peter's Church in New York. We're thinking about contemporary artists more recently as well, such as Ettore Spalletti, working in the funerary chapel that he created in Pescara, or Ellsworth Kelly's Austin, in this rather extraordinary minimalist Romanesque space that's installed at the Blanton Museum of Art as a permanent work. Our speakers tonight are really eminent speakers, I should say this afternoon as well, because we have people all around the world. We have Annie Cohen-Salal, academic and writer. Annie is the author of the acclaimed biography of Sartre, Sartre Life from 1987, but also has written books about Leo Castelli, about New York in the mid-century. And one of the reasons we have her here this evening is because she wrote a biography of Mark Rothko in 2013. She was the curator of the great Magicien de la Terre exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in 2014. She's taught widely around the world, and she's currently working on a project called Picasso the Foreigner, which will lead to an exhibition at the Picasso Museum in Paris and the Musée de la Migration, hopefully next year. Aaron Rosen joins us from, and Annie's joining us from Cortona. Aaron is joining us from Washington, D.C. Aaron is Professor of Religion and Visual Culture and Director of the Henry Luce III Center for the Arts and Religion at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington. He's a visiting professor at King's College London. He's taught at Oxford, at Cambridge, and widely around the world, and has curated exhibitions and written many books. His books include Imagining Jewish Art, Art and Religion in the 21st Century, and Brushes with Faith. He's currently working on a monograph called The Hospitality of Images, Modern Art and Interfaith Dialogue. Nausicaa El-Mekki joins us from Amsterdam, but is based in Barcelona. She's a tenure-track professor there in History of Art and Visual Culture at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. She specializes in iconoclasm and self-censorship in historical and contemporary settings. And Nausicaa has been in her current position since 2018. She was elected as a member of the German Young Academy for its 50 young academics in 2017 and won the Maria Graffin Award for original contributions to humanity in the same year. I'm going to go straight on, but I'm just going to give you a quick idea of how we're going to run this. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes, but I'd welcome any questions or comments from the audience in the Q&A box on this platform. And I'll be looking out for those and moderating them at the end of the discussion. What I've done is I've asked all of our speakers this evening to pick 1 or 2 images just to get the conversation going and to give us some perspective on the relevance and the role of post-war sacred spaces. So we're going to begin with Annie. I'm going to ask you to speak for just 2 minutes about the images you've chosen.
This is the Broken Obelisk by Barnett Newman. It's a sculpture that you have to pass in front of when you are going to step into the Rothko Chapel. And this sculpture, first of all, has the form of an Egyptian monument dedicated to one of the gods. But this monument is broken and it's put in a kind of precarious position on top of another Egyptian monument, which is a pyramid. Second thing, this monument being here has a long history. The patrons who decided to erect it here were the Dominils, patrons of the city of Houston, and they had decided to give a grant, a matching grant, to the mayor of Houston for a public monument with 2 strings attached. The one that it would be the Broken Obelisk by Barnett Newman, and the second one that it would be dedicated to Martin Luther King, who had just been assassinated. The year was 1969. The mayor of Houston refused. Therefore, the Dominils paid for the whole price and put that Broken Obelisk on their own property. Therefore, performing a very strong political gesture. Your law is not my law. Your order is not my order. Your ethics are not my ethics. And it's a gesture of a counter power. Therefore, when you decide to go into the Rothko Chapel, you're trying to find if you try to find a definition, what is a Rothko Chapel? It's impossible. And in such cases, you try to find what it is not. It is not a museum. It is not an art gallery. It is not a church. But it is all that and in between. So no, that's it. Finished? 2 minutes.
I'm going to move on because we're certainly going to come back to the Rothko Chapel today. And I think this idea of the relationship between patronage, belief and artistic freedom is something that we're going to be talking about, hopefully quite extensively. The next slide is Aaron's slide. If I can ask you, Aaron, to talk quickly about these images.
Absolutely. And it's a great pleasure to be alongside Annie and also to hear her address a work with such a challenge out of the gates in terms of paying due recognition to such an important leader in civil rights. And so that certainly chimes with the present moment of thinking for the struggle for racial equality. And I chose this work of the healthcare chaplaincy by Toby Kahn here on the left because it speaks to another part of our specific moment, which is what do we do? How do you heal the healers, as one documentary put it? What do we do for the frontline workers, nurses, sanitation workers, doctors who are struggling under the COVID crisis in overwhelmed cities? And I think Toby created this prescient work now 20 years ago in which he recognized that chaplains who are ministering to people, especially in these extraordinary circumstances generally, but especially in moments like today, would need spaces that provide a balm or salve, and to try to import some, as it were, smuggle in two influences, both the artistic and the religious, and try to meld those to both contribute to something that might have this healing potential. And on the right, I selected Toby's new concept here that will be freshly commissioned soon of a design for a sukkah. And for those who are not familiar with this Jewish tradition, in short, it happens every year in the autumn that Jews are supposed to go outside, that you're supposed to, after the highest holiday of the year, you're supposed to go outside, and there's supposed to be this communion with nature. And so you can see in this temporary dwelling, and really you're supposed to eat your meals out there, sleep out there, and it's a reminder of the diasporic existences of Jews, and as well as being this agricultural festival. And I think it speaks to a time right now where we're all trying to be outside. We're all wondering how it is that we can create a healthy balance in our life. But we're also acutely aware of those who don't have homes and the temporary nature of the structures they may or may not even have the privilege of inhabiting. And so I think Toby's work speaks to something which is religiously motivated, but actually conjures something that requires a very innovative artistic solution to meet this goal of this outside dwelling space.
The idea that artists might create solutions that are somehow spiritual or sacred and participatory is something that we will come back to, I'm sure. Nausicaa, I'm going to move on to your slide.
Hi. Yeah, so the example I picked is in a tiny South German village of Goldscheuer, where there was a very unusual decision made by lots of different people. So one day, a graffiti artist named Stefan Strumbel, who spent a lot of time illegally bombing, as he called it, so not with actual bombs, but quickly tagging and then running away, quickly bombing cars, trains, etc., etc. He came into that church and asked advice from the priest who worked there, because he wanted to create a work of art of a crucifix and wanted to know if he should add the skull above or underneath the crucifix. And that proved to be a very faithful meeting, so faithful that the priest later called the artist a gift from heaven, because the case was that when Stefan Strumbel entered that church, the church was really in danger. There were very few people coming, and the artist said it looked like a sports hall, so really depressing and empty. And he then suggested to the priest that he would reinvigorate the church by turning it into a spectacular graffiti church. And interestingly enough, the priest was like, okay, go for it. But obviously he didn't just have to convince the priest, they also had to convince not just the villagers who were paying for the church, but also the higher echelons. So they managed to do this, and they raised 50,000 euros from the villagers of Goldscheuer. And they had to show really detailed model drawings to all the higher ups in the church organization. And interestingly enough, they accepted everything. So they accepted speech bubbles, they accepted a 6-meter high Virgin Mary that we can see on the right side, who looks like a graffiti stencil. They accepted sort of speech bubbles above the votive candles, LED lighting, all the craziness. They just had one thing that I absolutely did not agree with, and that was the headgear of the Virgin Mary, because Stefan Strumbel apparently had made a fatal mistake by adorning her in a headgear called a Bollenhut, so a bowl hat. And this was not the right hat. This was the adornment of a village 20 kilometers away from Goldscheuer. So he had to change it to the more local Schleifenhaube. And once that was done, everybody was completely happy. And as you can expect, suddenly people came to the church by the busload. They still do, and it's a stunning, stunning space. And the interesting thing is that Stefan Strumbel is not a church-going artist at all. And for all his illegal activity, he said he'd never been as scared as when he was standing on the scaffolding in 2011 and about to open his can of spray paint.
It sounds like a scene from Don't Look Now, though. You end up falling off the scaffolding. But I think that there are two things there that we will certainly want to come back to. This idea of how far belief coincides with as it were, the achievement or accomplishment of a project. And the second one, which I think is really fascinating, is what you say about busloads of people coming into the church, and the sense in which modern and contemporary art in religious spaces might become a destination in and of itself. So that's something we'll certainly come back to. I am going to hold the slides just here for now. I will take them down later, but I think let's just dwell on this idea of the role of the sacred space in post-war art history. Let me ask you, Aaron, as someone who really specializes in this, do you feel like it's, to a certain degree, it's tangential to the main narrative of post-war art history, or is it something that should be more central?
Well, it's funny, Tom, that you said at the start that the sacred is kind of a footnote to the history of modern and contemporary art generally, because I wrote a book on this subject, and I thought that's actually pretty fitting that I would take a footnote and write a book about it, fitting for academics generally. But I actually think that it is a neglected part. I actually think it's quite a large one, because I think the idea of inhabiting religious spaces, every time I talk to artists, this is one of the ambitions that they have. Not necessarily that it be a religious space, but they have an opportunity to conjure a particular type of relationship with the viewer. And it should be this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk. It should be encompassing and enfolding, that people should have time to be there. There should be a contemplative relationship, even ritual components to how people experience these works. And what's interesting to me is that artists, as they grow in stature over the history of their careers, so often when those opportunities unfold themselves, that's exactly what they want to do. That is seen as this kind of crowning achievement. And where do we have these kind of spaces? And where do we have the ambition from the public to produce these spaces? Oftentimes ones that have a connection with religion, either to inhabit a church that has falling membership, as we saw any example, or one that, or a cathedral that needs to be re-energized, and wants to take advantage of a type of artistic pilgrimage. So the opportunities for artists as they grow in stature really bring them, I think, lead them to these directions. So it's no mistake that we find this happening again and again of these major modern religious art spaces.
So it's a sort of teleology for many post-war artists. They have to hit once they hit the high notes, they need to hit a chapel or something like that.
And even if they seem like the types who wouldn't want to, right? And I think that's what's very surprising. I mean, I remember once going to a talk with Anthony Caro, and people tried to engage him on religion. He said, basically, absolutely not, or I'm kind of walking out of here. And yet he does a chapel in France, right? And you have Mark Rothko, who berated really a number of his friends at one stage. There's a record of a kind of a dinner party where people were doing, all of his friends were doing synagogue spaces or thinking about these. Said, I would never do this. Right? And then the right opportunity comes up for this chapel, and he thinks, this is where I want to pour so much of my energy at this stage in my career.
Annie, let's talk about the Rothko Chapel, since we have the image up. For you, I mean, is this a fons et origo, a starting point for a lot of other artists who are thinking about what they're going to make in the world of spiritual art?
I do agree. I think that Rothko is increasingly becoming an important artist for the market, for the viewers, for the collectors. But he's also, and maybe once and for all, an artist. For many artists today, he's a hero. Why is he a hero? Because he won many fights over things that really bother the artist. He won a fight against institutions. He never identified with any institution of the country where he immigrated at age 10. He fought the Met, he fought the Whitney. He found the country both isolationist and Philistine, and he was very strict about it. He was obsessional about it. He never gave up. He never negotiated, and he also fought the galleries. He left Sidney Janis to Marlborough, and he felt that Marlborough was terrible, much too commercial. And in the end, he also rejected the commission of the Four Seasons building, where he was to do panels, because he didn't want that his beautiful panels be in front of these ugly people who were having a dinner for $1,000. So basically, he kept to his focus that art has to be shared with the artist. People have to interact. People have to sit in front of the art. People have to spend time in front of the art. And he never gave up on that. In the end, what happened? He met with the de Menils, who were the dream patrons. In 1964, they came to him and they commissioned the chapel. So it was really the coming together of two trajectories, actually three trajectories. The de Menil's trajectory, immigrants from France. They came to Houston in 1941. The trajectory of Mark Rothko, immigrant from Russia into the United States, who came to the country in 1913. And one of the things that I find extremely beautiful is that it was the masterpiece of Mark Rothko. He considered it his masterpiece. It was inaugurated day per day, 1 year before he committed suicide, by Dominique de Menil. And he had told her the model he had in mind when he did these 14 panels. Actually, he did 18 of them, but 14 panels. He said that he wanted to replicate what he had seen in a Byzantine chapel near Venice, in an island called Torcello, Santa Maria Assunta di Torcello, where he had seen two panels facing each other, one of the Last Judgment, striking, dark, gloomy, and the other one in front of the Virgin and Child. And he said that there was a tension between tragedy and hope, and that's what he tried to reproduce in a way in the Rothko Chapel. So, did I answer your question?
You did, and let me ask Nausicaa as well. I mean, thinking about this particular space, I mean, what do you think it's made possible for other artists?
That's a great question. I think it's created the opportunity of redefining immersion, I think. I think if I look at the Dutch churches that I've sort of half grown up with, going with friends who would drag me there, a lot of these were Protestant churches, and then sometimes there'd be like a little apologetic sculpture in the corner. So there'd be often quite, sort of very utilitarian, deliberately not very aesthetic buildings. And then there'd be, so the buildings were almost abstract. And then there would be some twisty, half figurative sculpture thing. When I look at this, it seems like you can make something that is so immersive and so intense to look at and has so many emotions. And at the same time, it can be interpreted in so many ways. And I think it has created a different way of influencing, and what Aaron also mentioned before, this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, of really finding what that can be. And yeah, I think it's amazing to just look at that and to really find it in that way.
I'm so interested in this notion. I may remove the slide now. I'm so interested in this notion that Rothko was thinking about Byzantine mosaics at Torcello. I mean, Rothko also obsessed with Fra Angelico and other in the Italian tradition. Aaron, would you say that this tradition of the artist chapel means that we're always interpreting this type of scheme in among its Christian precursors?
Yes and no, of course, right? Typical academic answer, but I think there is there's certainly a Christian presumption, right? And I think one of the things is that the history of art in Western art is a largely Christian enterprise. For those who've read the great book, My Name is Asher Lev, this is a great domain where this young Jewish artist, his mentor takes him to the Met and says, if you want to make the world sacred, you may be a Jew, but you got to look at nudes and you got to look at crucifixes, And so I think it's part of it is that this is the history of Western art, and it's so deeply colored by Christianity that becomes inescapable. One of the interesting dimensions, though, is you can interact with these Christian traditions without being Christian, and also perhaps without acceding to some of the dimensions there. So interestingly, with the Rothko Chapel, you have someone who is intrigued by the idea of having 14 canvases, a number directly recalling the Stations of the Cross, something that Barnett Newman also tackled. And that doesn't mean that by tackling Christian art, they were necessarily acceding to all aspects of Christian dogma in any way. They were using it to catalyze questions that they saw actually either lay beneath or above Christian tradition. So with Barnett Newman doing his Stations of the Cross, he said the problem with the crucifix, he said, was that in an age that it experienced the Holocaust and it experienced Hiroshima, you needed something more. So he felt that he was creating something which pushed Christian tradition to points where it was deeply uncomfortable, where that element of tragedy, to use Rothko's tragedy and hope dynamic, where the tragedy was the more dominant note than the hope, right? And so I think it's always that interesting process of negotiation with a tradition, and some of the best negotiations are by people that belong outside of that tradition.
Annie, how did the Rothko Chapel become a non-denominational space?
Dominique de Ménil was someone who had been trained with the Protestant tradition in France. The French are Calvinist, and Protestants in France are a minority, which has been really destroyed by the destruction of the Protestants were chased, and they were chased by the Catholic majority, and they recognized themselves close to the Jews. They went into hiding, and they went into, so there has been always a very strong elective affinity between Jews and Protestants in France. Now in 1947, Dominique de Ménil meets with a Dominican priest called Père Alain Couturier, who has started before World War II, in 1937, a magazine called Sacred Art. And the reasons for that was that he said there's no reason why there's no beautiful contemporary art in our churches, and there's no reason why our churches could not be built by brilliant architects. I would prefer somebody who does not believe and who's a genius architect instead of a poor Catholic architect. So on those bases, he showed Madame de Ménil models of those chapels, like the Matisse Chapel near Vence, like Le Corbusier Chapel and the Fernand Léger Chapel in Aulncourt. That rang the bell for her, and then she would go on to that much later on in the mid-60s, thinking of Mark Rothko. But what is very interesting is that the coming together of the project of the de Ménils against the context of the United States of the 60s and of Mark Rothko is, creating a unity. You talk about Gesamtwerk, that's a Gesamt project, you see. And what I find extraordinary is that Rothko has also, we were talking about World War II. 1940 is a key year for him, as well as for Barnett Newman. Rothko puts his brushes aside in 1940 for a whole year. What does he do? He writes a book. He's a philosopher anyway. He has a very strong abstract mind, conceptual mind. Actually, he was trained in the Talmud Torah until age 10. And he is a very powerful thinker. So during that whole year where he doesn't paint, he's writing a book called The Artist's Reality, which is going to be published many decades later in 2008 by his son. But in this book, he revisited art history and revisited also one of his favorite painters, who is Rembrandt, Nausicaa, somebody close to you. And besides, the two painters have something in common. They use the last years of their life by going against the grain, against the test of the market. Rembrandt to try and find a way to produce light, how to produce light, and Rothko trying to his main question was how to produce light in the chapel. And what I find extraordinary in this Rothko Chapel is that there's a dialogue, we didn't speak yet about that, between architecture and art. The artist, dances with the architect. And the architect of the Rothko Chapel was the same architect as for the Seagram building, Philip Philip Johnson, a very different type of person as Rothko, and they fought. Philip Johnson wanted to add a kind of well on the top, and Rothko said, no, I don't want that. And Dominique de Menil, what did she do? She decided to step for the artist. And she said this beautiful sentence, the architect had to bow in front of the artist. So here is a coming together of many minds, of many creative minds, and in order to produce this space, which is basically in between so many elements. It's at the crossroads of politics, of ethics, of architecture, of art, and of spirituality. And I think that makes it universal. It's also a place which is loaded with the images of the visitors who went there, Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama. It's loaded with images of the past, like Martin Luther King assassination, Martin Luther King march on Washington, D.C. So this is a space which also has inspired so many people. It inspired artists, it inspired musicians, it inspired poets, it inspired writers, and it inspired also thinkers, because it is a place where people gathered for symposium on human rights, for example. It's a place where prizes are being given, and so it's a unique place, and it became one of the best destination for visiting art places in the whole country.
It's really fascinating the way you describe it, almost like a laboratory for the mind, and whether the mind is secular or whether the mind is spiritually attuned, and therefore that it's a space that might be transformative in and of itself. I wanted to go back to this point, though, about the collaboration between, say, patron, architect, and artist. Let's think about it not just in the context of the Rothko Chapel, because I want to take a broader scope. Nausicaa, in thinking about post-war sacred spaces with contemporary art or modern art interventions or projects in them, have the most successful tended to allow for total artistic independence, or is there a sense in which there's a formality of following doctrinal concerns, for instance?
Yeah, personally, I don't believe in unlimited artistic freedom, in the sense that, not that I want people to have unlimited artistic freedom. That'd be amazing. I just don't believe it exists. So I think this idea that we have right now, that ideally the best art is where an artist is not like the puppets, also patron, and, acting out, the ideas of a religion or a political idea or whatever, is something that I think we've increasingly come to believe in as a society, and with the idea of art for art's sake, and that it's somehow more pure, which is almost a sort of religion of its own, like the best and purest art is not, tied to any sort of ulterior motives. It's pure and therefore more sacred. And I think that's, on the one hand, a really interesting idea. And it also makes museums a bit like temples, right? You come in and you go through the whole ritual of going through the metal detector and being very quiet and behaving properly and not screaming. At the same time, I think that even though we tend to admire artists who place their individualistic artistic vision on a space and say, oh, well, they're amazing because they weren't, doing what the Pope told them to do or something, I think that's a really naive ideal, and I don't really believe in it. I think that artists have always acted in some kind of interest, whether that is their own self-promotion or the art market or their ideals, even if they're subconscious. I think it always plays a role, and I don't necessarily think that art is better or freer when it is being very deliberately not free. And the example I'd like to give is from the Venice Biennale, when the Vatican for the first time had its exhibition at the Venice Biennale. I think it was in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And I read some interviews with artists who participated, and even though the theme was Genesis, all the artists were like, no, but I don't do what the Vatican tells me to do, and I completely interpreted it myself, and I'm a Marxist, and I'm an atheist, and being all apologetic about it. And I thought, what a pity! Why you're trying too hard, man. Basically,
I think about the poem, Robert Browning's poem, Fra Lippo Lippi, a dramatic monologue. It's a great roguish character, and the whole poem is about this idea that you're really having to assume a character when you're taking on a religious commission if you're someone who doesn't necessarily believe in it. But I suppose for other artists, for some artists, there's a way of thinking through faith or a lack of faith in the assumption of a project, in the progress of a project. Is that the case, Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I was just thinking along those lines is that one of the things is, of course, and you bring up, the example from a poet, I think, is that, poetic strictures can, of course, induce creativity, right? As you find ways to navigate or work within these. And so I think that's often been the case with religious structures and especially living religious communities, which we're oftentimes ignoring about the actual people who live and utilize these spaces. And I sort of think about a friend of mine, Michael Takeo Magruder, a very gifted new media artist, and he created a piece that I worked with him on at a church in the heart of Washington, D.C., and it was used by homeless people. And there's no place in D.C., as so many American cities find, for homeless people to be and to have that kind of safety. And so he had to recognize that he was creating this work with really expensive technology, and you had to have a certain element of risk taking, because the primary need were the people that are being served by the space. And then, as it turned out, which we hadn't thought about in advance, was that every Friday this church was also used for Jummah, so it was used for Muslim prayer. And so you had the oddity of a work that was inspired, in Michael's case, a piece called Lamentation of the Forsaken, that was about Syrian refugees using the Shroud of Turin as iconographic inspiration. And there was Muslim prayer going on there, and there were homeless people that were coming back and forth in and out of this space. And so there, the practical requirements of the space not only dictated the kind of work he produced, helped shape the kind of work he produced, but also shape the audiences in really unexpected ways. And I think that's one of the things that we have to look at as a really productive way in which bringing art outside of museums exposes artists to living communities who interact with them in different ways. And the great artists I've met, they want that. They want to have their work seen by people who wouldn't normally see it. And so there's something actually liberating in some of these structures.
This is where I take us back briefly to Rothko, because it seems that if we're thinking about the Rothko Chapel as a new model for sacred space, perhaps one of the models we're thinking about there is how there is this is a place for immersive contemplation. We've used the words, we've thought about immersion, but at the same time, participation, because Annie, you've described to us the symposia, the visitors, the sense of this being a collaborative place with which happens to have these paintings, but the paintings are somehow a commentary on what might happen in that space. Can I just ask Aaron just to say a bit more about this idea about how perhaps the chapel has become a place not just for contemplation, but for participation, the Artist Chapel?
Yeah, and I think, with Rothko, there's the question of what kind of imagery best suits this, right? And is it things that are abstract forms that people can find themselves really swallowed by the expanse in that way in Rothko? One of the things I think is interesting for Rothko is that he wanted specifically to use forms that were like triptychs and evoke the sense of an altar. So he actually saw this as something that was contributing to the type of reflection that he wanted from people, that you really do. And Annie gave the example of his inspiration from Torcello and baptistries, and that he liked the idea that you would process towards something and you would spend time and you would sit there in a something contemplative, but perhaps even to a certain degree prayerful. And And I think that's really important, is how we use those kind of spaces. And with the Nevelson Chapel, look, it can get messy sometimes. After she created it at the start, Nevelson was the most famous female artist for sure, and one of the most famous artists, as you saw in her grand fur coat and her outfits, that she was a major presence in New York City at the time she created this. But in the ensuing years, Nevelson falls off the map just a little bit, and people start to just say, well, this is a good place to have the Spanish chapel service. We need a smaller adjunct chapel space. Or what if that we need to bring in for more private wedding ceremonies? And art gets knocked around a little bit when that happens, which is why there's a restoration in process. So people using religious spaces makes demands of artwork that are different. And there's a give and take that happens with that. But ultimately, I think for many artists, the idea, even if it's somewhat unforeseen, that their work is exposed to ritual context provides really generative modes of understanding that are very different from that museum experience. Not only because you have other people around, and you can't all process and things in the way of the museums have their own rituals, right? But the rituals that are most interesting might be those religious ones.
Well, I take us onto a chapel that we've only mentioned, I think, a couple of times so far, which is the Chapel of the Rosary, designed by Matisse at Vence. But of course, one of the things that Matisse designed, almost the, as it were, the crowning achievement of that chapel with its work of light and extending the idea of the cutouts, was the chasubles, were the garments that the priests in the church would wear, wearable artworks for part of this ritual performance. And Nausicaa, how much do you think that for artists working in this space, that feeling of art being part of the performance has been central to their work?
I think that's great. I love that idea of that the art doesn't just hang on a wall, but it moves. I think the interesting thing is that the example that you just mentioned, of the clergy also wearing robes that are designed by an artist, and this idea of performativity almost of art is something that is actually, to me, is something that has a really, really long tradition. So I'm just thinking about how the altarpiece would only be uncovered at certain times, it would only be opened at Easter. So there's always this kinetic element, or people would wear amulets around their neck. Or if you look at the details of really old robes, there's all these tiny details. And then if an iconoclasm came, that's also the first thing that would go, right? They wouldn't just get rid of the art, but they would always also get rid of the robes of the clergy. So to me, it's something that has a really, really long tradition, and that makes art and imagery and the sort of visual immersion even more kinetic. It's not stable, it's not staid. So when I think about it for modern artists, I almost wish they did it more.
I think you said something really interesting, though, which is that in a sense we might have misunderstood, or we easily misunderstand, the longer history of religious spaces as venues for art, because the things that are movable are more likely to have become ephemeral, or to have been lost from the record, or to have moved into museums to be displayed elsewhere. So perhaps we have a sort of almost modernist hardening up in some ways. That might be one tradition where many artists think, I've got to create something that is very, very static and as a space for a white cube for contemplation.
I think that's a really good point, and I think we forget that immersion and performativity and ritual is such a profound part of art. And I almost feel that sometimes when I've looked at just gallery openings, for instance, that people are almost afraid of that playful and coming off the walls aspect. So if you go to gallery openings, you have champagne, but you don't eat too much, there are no musicians, it's white walls, no light effects, because that's vulgar, that distracts from the art. Whereas if you look at sacred spaces, it's everywhere, like in the Toby Kahn example, didn't he even design the chairs?
He did.
They control everything.
I mean, he actually thought, I want people to leave a subtle impression behind, right? And so I think, as it were, so I think there's yeah, again, these kind of practicalities, the mundanities, and I think talking as a Jew, I think one of the things is that that debates about practicalities can actually lead you into philosophically really rich territory. And I think about an example of a church in London where Henry Moore's marble altar was brought in, and there was a massive debate, and Tom will know this, about at St. Stephen Walbrook is does this constitute an altar, which no one thought to ask before moving this massive piece of marble in, right? And in Anglican tradition, an altar should be a table. And so it should have table legs. And this has all sorts of implications for when you think about Anglican departures from Catholic understandings of the Eucharist and what's being done at Mass. And so you have something that's really, really seemingly mundane. Is this a table? And it actually becomes really, really profound debate about the very essence of what's being performed religiously.
This sounds like a Victorian debate about functionality and the symbolism of architecture and architectural elements. Let me just ask before I look at some of the questions in the Q&A. Is there a risk? I'm playing devil's advocate in asking the question. Annie, is there a risk in a sense that with these type of places, with Vence, with the Leger Chapel, with the Rothko Chapel, that they become places where we go to worship art rather than think about how spiritual concerns relate to more mundane concerns? Or is that okay for us to go to worship art?
I think that there's a word which comes to my mind by watching the examples taken by Aaron and Nausicaa. It's the word subversion. In those sacred spaces, there's a possibility of subversion because there is those places are thresholds for other options. And I think that in those places, what is shifted is the regime of time, the regime of temporality. And people live a different time. The museum, the modern museum was combining, remember the MoMA created by Alfred Barr in 1929, it was altogether a Kunstmuseum and a Kunsthalle, a permanent collection and a contemporary space. So it was combining two regimes of time. With the Rothko Chapel, for example, you have the broken obelisk, which reminds you of ancient Egyptian history, which is 5,000 years ago, but a broken god. And you have the dedication to Martin Luther King, which is the 60s, right here. The George Floyd problem, an African American being killed in front of TV by the police. And then you have the time of the church. So you have the combination of all those regimes of time, and that gives it's blurring borders, and it gives a possibility of subversion. And basically that's also because of those places thanks to those places, that we are going to a new type of museum, that we allowing new elements to take place in the museum, So those places become a threshold for our contemporary world. And I would add, so it's about time, but it's also about space, because I want to add that we've spoken a lot about Christian models, but we have to remember that we are much too ethnocentric. We have been much too ethnocentric in our Western museums, and what we have not looked at enough sufficiently is, for example, the other cultures which have created, in which artists have created those altars, those wonderful altars. And Jean-Hubert Martin, my friend, created this exhibition called Altars to look at the way artists have created ways of worshiping in different cultures, which are as wonderful as what we can see in our culture. So it's both. Sorry, thank you. Go ahead.
No, and as you point out, Annie, I think it's just terrific that you mention these opportunities to foreground diversity, because I think you gave the example of Alfred Barr and MoMA and some of the early exhibitions that were so important to the history and the evolution of modernism were works of African art, and they were really primarily examples of sacred art, but which don't get taken like that. But there's an opportunity, as you mentioned, subversion for those very objects to talk back to modernism and actually refresh the kind of challenges that artists need to return to. And we're seeing so much more attention to this. It's really exciting, like with the British Museum, with their Aboriginal art exhibition, that they felt, as they should do, the need to consult some of the Aboriginal elders and communities from whom these objects were taken. And they said to them, for the protection of the viewers, don't put some of this on show, because some of these are deadly works of art. I think it's just such an incredibly powerful, potent idea of this subversion, that these works of art could kill you if you haven't done the induction ceremonies in an Aboriginal context.
Yes, yes.
Let me see if there are just a few questions that we might take. There was an interesting question about really, I suppose this returns us to Couturier and especially Vence, and the idea of you know, how a religious art can be stimulated if it needs stimulation, in terms of there are a lot of buildings that might be either empty or might be neglected. You know, whose role is it to encourage this type of commissioning or risk taking in religious spaces?
Visionary priests. Shout out to my friend Ralph Peterson for the Nevelson, but you also have to have the sensitivity to know how to respond to your congregation and their authentic needs. But you have to have the courage not to be bogged down in endless committee meetings. And Ben Quash, one of my colleagues at King's College London, gives the example of the blue pipes at Catford, that you can get really, really bad works of art when you do things that are consensus. And so there's that question of how are you responsive to communities and their authentic needs, I think, especially at this moment. But at the same time, how do you not get down to someone saying, well, I like blue, I like yellow, I think it should be metal. And I've seen this end up with terrible commissions or a failure to commission a work of art because people get stuck in these kind of negotiations.
Someone asks on the chat box whether the natural journey of this type of work is from a sacred space into a museum. I mean, are these things created as if for eternity? It would strike me that the Seven Strumbel piece is very much of the moment.
Yeah, I love that question. I already noticed it in the chat box. I think if we think about how museums sort of got their current or modern function, it was to protect them. It was to neutralize them almost. So if we look at museums that appeared during the French Revolution, when piles and piles of art were being burned and citoyens were dancing around the bonfire going, more destruction, art was, museums were a way to keep them safe, to say, okay, well, this may be propaganda for the church or for the aristocracy, but it's in a museum now, so we can just enjoy them aesthetically, right? And sometimes this is exactly what museums are accused of, right? They rip things out of their context and you just see something that is purely aesthetic. And then on top of everything else, museums pretend they're neutral, but as we know, museums are not neutral in any way whatsoever, right? There's a lot of ideology there, from focus on white people to the rituals that are enacted there to the lack of participation. Usually, there's a lot of ideological layering there. So museums aren't neutral spaces, but they pretend that they are. And I think we have a tendency to indeed think that, perhaps once chapels or churches are less popular or less needed, it would be a way to get, to hack out Stefan Strumbel's art like a Banksy and then drag it over to the next museum to keep it safe, right? And the question is it then still the work of art, So is it still whole? Especially if something was created for that place, I know that some artists are like, I don't care where you put my work of art, and others are like, the moment you move it, even slightly, you destroy it. So I think the answer to your question, person from the chat box, is that I think this idea of a natural progression is something, I think we've become so used to the position museums take in our society that we think this has been in like this for hundreds and hundreds of years, but actually it's a new system with its own ideology that is still, you know, adapting to these new times. And ultimately the question is, will it also be safe in a museum? You know, are museums really safe places, or will it end up in a depot and never be seen again? So I think the natural progression doesn't necessarily end with a museum.
I see that, Annie, over to you.
I just want to add a point. I want to suggest an event which I took part in, and which seems to me very much to go with what we're saying tonight. And I want to check with my friends. When I went to attend the installation of Cristo on Lake Iseo, called Floating Piers. It attracted 1.5 million viewers. Cristo has completely subverted the model of the gallery. Cristo does not want to work with galleries. He sells directly to collectors, and that allows viewers to attend and to enjoy his events for free. Now, the people who arrive on these piers, walk on the piers. It was one of the most magical things I've ever seen in my life. It was like a pilgrimage, and it was walking on water on this fabric, orange fabric. Okay, those people would experience that for a whole day, and they would leave, and they would be given a little gift, which was a little square of orange fabric that they would keep in their pocket. That's it. But I think it's very close to a sacred space, that experience. And it's completely subversive towards the system.
I'm afraid that...
And we were walking on water.
well, we can end with an image of visitors of Cristo enabling 1.5 million people to walk on water. The idea of the participatory miracle. I'm afraid we are out of time. I know that there are many things that have been thrown up by this discussion. I've seen the names of, we haven't talked about Richter's windows in Cologne. We haven't talked about Hockney. We haven't talked about Bill Viola. We haven't talked about many architects and artists. But I hope that it's food for thought for everybody who has been watching and listening this evening. I want to say thank you very much to our panelists, to Aaron Rosen, to Annie Cohen-Salal, and to Nausicaa Almeki. Tomorrow evening / afternoon at the same time, we will be presenting an event about hooked onto the Frick Collections movement, moving to the Breuer Building on Madison Avenue. And this event will be called Old Masters, New Spaces, Historical Art in Modernist Buildings. We'll be thinking about Louis Kahn, we'll be thinking about Lina Bo Bardi, we'll be thinking about Carlo Scarpa and others. So I hope that you'll register for that event. And thank you very much, and please do enjoy TAFAF online.